Written human language has been around for a very long time. The original written language that we're aware of comes from ancient Mesopotamia in Sumeria, and it is from around the time of 3400 BC. Think about that for a second. 5,400 years ago is when we have the oldest known form, complete form of human written communication. Back then, human communication was generally done on either stone or clay tablets, either by scratching or chiseling the writing into the stone, or using some form of stylus to push the symbols into wet clay and then allow the wet clay to dry. Archaeologists have found many different examples of these types of writings over the years, which has helped us to learn and grow about our knowledge of how writing developed among human cultures. By the time most of the Old Testament scriptures were being written down, there were many other options for writing utensils and writing materials. Most popular in the day of Jesus for writing materials would have been wax tablets, parchment, vellum, and papyrus. Wax tablets were interesting because they were designed for temporary writing. These were surfaces that were smeared with a thin coat of wax and then secured into a wooden frame. Whatever author was using them could then take a stylus and press into the wax and make the writing the symbols that they needed to for later purposes. Most of the time, these were used by court reporters or scribes and students writing down the words of teachers and masters, or by accountants. And so they were able to write in shorthand, and then if they needed to, copy their shorthand into long form later on more permanent materials. These were pretty neat instruments because the wax could then later be re-flattened and reused. Parchment and vellum were made out of animal skin, and they were more sturdy, so they would typically last longer. Papyrus was formed out of the pith of a plant with the same name. These sheets that were created would have been sewn together into much longer sheets and then rolled up into scrolls for use at a later time. Shorter documents might have been folded more in a accordion type format to be used and stored later. The modern day book with a binding on one side that opens up with pages stacked on top of each other wasn't invented until about the 1st century AD by the Romans, but it wasn't really in wider use until probably the 3rd century AD, and then it was fairly dominant by the time you get to the 6th century AD. Many biblical scholars believe that at a small archaeological site near the Dead Sea called Qumran, we get kind of a peek behind history's curtain at how these sacred Jewish texts would have been copied and then disseminated around the ancient world. Qumran was actually found in the mid-19th century, but went largely unexplored until in the mid-20th century, a group of people found a huge hidden stash of ancient Jewish manuscripts throughout the cave system that were near Qumran. This led to a lot of interest to look into Qumran. And as they did, they began to put the puzzle pieces together that this location may have been the home of one of the early sects of Jewish thinking and belief in the time of Jesus. This group was known as the Essenes and was mentioned by multiple other ancient sources. What we know about this group is that they believed that the temple structure was completely corrupt, and so they committed themselves to living a life of simplicity and holiness and cleanliness as they awaited for the coming Messiah and the end of days. This group may have lived here at Qumran, and some of the archaeological evidence seems to indicate that one of the ways they may have made money was to copy the ancient manuscripts of the Jewish texts and sell them to local synagogues, or actually regional synagogues, to be used. If this is true, then it's super interesting that maybe Jesus would have used and read from one of these scrolls written by the Essenes at Qumran during his time of teaching in one of the synagogues in Galilee. But we'll talk a little bit more about the Essenes and potentially the process that they developed in copying the texts in the next video. For now, Let's look at some of the original materials used to actually copy down the text. As you can see, these are some replicas of some of the materials and one instrument that they would have used in the 1st century or around that time for copying and writing materials. Over here you can see that we have 3 different examples of materials that were used. The first is papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that was then processed and flattened out and formed into large sheets that they would then cut into different sizes. And so you could see that papyrus left kind of a non-uniform texture to the surface. It's a bit rough, and you could feel all of those different thicknesses as you look at it. The front side of the papyrus feels a bit smooth, kind of like a high-end paper, paper that you would buy for making something special out of or putting a special note together. On the back end, it's a little bit rougher, less smooth, less finished, but you can see and get a sense of what this material would have been like to write on. Much like paper, it's fairly flexible. You could put a crease in it, you can fold it, and again, in the ancient times, they would have taken smaller documents and folded them with this into kind of accordion shapes that they could then read. Over here you have parchment, and parchment was made from animal skins, and it was a process of breaking down the animal skins, cleaning them, tanning them, bleaching them in some way or another to make them brighter color like this to write on, and then they would then cut them into different shapes or sizes for their use, and then they would bind them with more animal skin, leather, on the edges into larger, longer sections, but each page itself would have been written on with a couple of columns, and they would have been considered a different page. And so they would know exactly how many pages within a scroll would be needed for a particular document that they were copying. But if you feel this and look at this, it's kind of like cardstock. It's very thick. It feels really substantial. The front side is very, very smooth and it feels like it would be fairly easy to write on. And the back side is a little bit rougher and has a little bit of a texture to it. And then this is a material called vellum. This was also produced out of animal hide in some form or another, usually a type of membrane that they were able to pull off of the animal hide and then to process until they got it to this look. And you can see that it looks very consistent, looks very clean. It is very, very smooth on both front and back, although the back has a little bit more of a texture than the front. And it's almost got a transparent see-through type of look to it. And it's a little thicker than paper, but not quite as thick as the parchment. And so it would have saved space to have a scroll made of vellum over the parchment. And they would have used either vellum or parchment for the Torah from only clean animals, especially in the Masoretic period. They would have used animals that were killed in a way that was according to kosher laws and like the dietary restrictions. And then they would have cleaned them in a particular way to make sure that they remained ritually clean and pure for this use. Here you could see an example of an kind of Roman period papyrus scroll. And you can see, if you look in the inside here, that on the spindle in the inside, the scroll is actually adhered to the spindle so that they can then wrap the scroll around from there. And this is the kind of scroll that they might keep in a library or some kind of an archive of a shorter type of scroll that could be fully unraveled and didn't need 2 spindles. And then it would have been tied with something, maybe not as fancy as a ribbon like this, but some kind of a tie around the center in order to keep it secured. You can see here a replica of an inkwell and a stylus or a writing instrument. So the inkwell is just made out of clay, very simple little vessel that has a narrow opening and a shaft that goes down that holds ink. And then the stylus for writing was also just simple, made out of some kind of a bamboo or type of reed that they could then split and create a groove in so that that would hold the ink as they dipped it into the inkwell. And as they pulled it back out, the point would then direct that ink onto whatever writing
material that they were using. Now, a stylus like this wouldn't have lasted as long because the tips would have broken pretty quickly, and so they would have replaced these fairly regularly. And Romans created other types of writing utensils, even in the first century, that were much less common, but that had tips either made of metal or other things that were much more sturdy and lasted a lot longer, and actually made a nicer imprint of ink as well. So these are the types of materials that they would have used in the first century as they were recording texts and handing them down.
In the first century, papyrus like this would have been fairly cheap and sufficient for quick communication between people over a long distance. They would have used it to write down a letter and then have a courier carry it, or somebody they knew carry it on their travels across whatever city destination it was to go to. Many disciples in the early days of Christianity, Paul and others, would have used papyrus scrolls like these in order to write letters to the early church, which was forming all over the Roman Empire. If a letter had a specific importance and needed to have the authenticity of being from the author themselves, then it might have looked something like this: a scroll of papyrus wrapped up together and then sewn through with a thread that went through the actual papyrus itself and then was sealed at the end with a clay or wax stamped seal. Now, if the scroll got to its destination with the seal in place, then the recipients could feel fairly certain that this scroll was authentic and came from the original author. The oldest known modern kind of book form of the Bible, or also known as a codex, is from the 4th century, and it's been taken care of and kept safe by the Roman Church all the way until today. By the time the Protestants were around, modern-day books were a regular thing, not printed by a printing press, still written by hand, but bound like we have books today. The printing press came just a little bit after that. The process of making paper was actually defined by the Chinese in the 2nd century BC, but they didn't really fully refine it and use it more in their own culture until probably the 1st or 2nd century AD. It wasn't really adopted as a process for making a writing material in the West until about the 8th century. But until then, the parchments that were used before were regularly used to continue to pass down the scriptures from generation to generation. Even today, some Jewish groups continue to write the Torah and the other books of the Hebrew Bible into parchment and bind them together into codexes for use or scrolls for use in worship today.